All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Earn Your Runtime. This is the first time I'm trying this. Basically, I'm going to talk about movies and TV shows every week when I can. I'm a full time college student, so I don't know how often this will happen. But yeah, this week we're going to be talking about Hamnet, which is something that I watched with my friends. I want to say 2-3 days ago, so it's still pretty fresh. Um, First, I kind of want to get into my rating. I think I'll start the weeks kind of just talking about the rating, what I liked about the movie, and then, what I didn't like, what I appreciated, what I thought was good, what I thought was bad, etc. Kind of just like a breakdown of the whole thing. I really like Paul Mescal. I think that's how you say his name. He's been an actor that over the past couple years has kind of over time become a favorite for me. Someone that I don't know, just kind of out of nowhere ended up being someone that stood out to me as an actor that I would kind of look out for. Like if he was in a new movie, I would watch it. And he's very quickly become, I don't know, basically like one of my favorites. So now looking at the rating, I did give it a 10. So it's a high rating. It's a high boast for me. I don't hand out 10s very often. I think the last 10 I gave was for A Different Man, which is another movie that I'm probably not going to do an episode on just because I don't think there's a need for it. But yeah, so I guess before I watched this movie, obviously I was pretty into Paul Mescal as an actor. He was in All of Us Strangers. That's something that I really enjoyed. I thought that was a really good movie that I'd love to do like a longer episode on, just kind of talking about what I like about that movie, because I just feel like it's an incredible movie. You should definitely watch it. So yeah, Hamnet, released 2025, starring Paul Mescal and Jessie Buckley, which I'd never seen her before. It's the first time I've seen her. I know she's been in some things. There's been a lot of talk of her, obviously, especially after the movie. I know she was in a few things. I think she was in a few movies that got slight praise. I think she was in Fargo as well, the TV series. She kind of knocked the performance out of the park. She was really good in the movie, but we won't start with the performances just yet. Basically, before I watched the movie, I had very little, I guess, interest in kind of Shakespearean theater. It's not something that interested me to that extent. Nothing that really stood out to me. I know about it. I think I had to read some plays in school, but it's not something that I was super, looking forward to. But it's something I'm kind of excited to talk about it. So I didn't have much experience with it. I know a bit about Shakespeare because of a podcast I had listened to called Historically High. Shout out to Historically High, where they talked about his life. So I kind of knew, spoilers if you haven't watched the movie, there's some tragedy. So I kind of knew what the main tragic part of the movie was going to be, just because of that knowledge. But I really didn't know how they were going to do it, and I really didn't know much about how that tragedy came to be. Again, spoiler alert, his son dies. Hamnet, that's the name of the kid, name of the movie. So I didn't really know much about it. So going into it, I was pretty, I guess, blind. All I had known was that it was, nominated for a bunch of Oscars. So, and to be honest, last year's Oscars kind of taught me, a lesson. Before, I had kind of put a lot of stock in the Oscars, maybe more than I should have. Like if a movie was nominated or had a lot of nominations, I kind of thought like, oh, it must be a good movie. But after last year, I kind of learned that that's not always the case. So I stopped trusting that. So it didn't really sway me at all in terms of the experience. Like I went into it thinking like, okay, this has a lot of critical praise, but it doesn't mean it's a good movie, at least for me, right? And I know this is something that's really subjective, but for me at least, it wasn't a huge factor. But anyway, you start off the movie in like, I don't know, the movie starts off very odd and kind of abrupt, right? Like you're kind of introduced to this character and this weird, almost mystical woodland scenery. It's introduced very weird. I will say, like, the characters are introduced very in a very weird manner, and the kind of relationship between Paul Mescal and Jesse Buckley, like it just very abruptly starts, like kind of out of nowhere they're banging, and it's kind of weird. Like, I don't really know why that happens. It is a very abrupt start, but basically, they start a family, and like you go through that with them. And she's a bit of a, I guess she's a bit of an outcast. Her mother died. She's a stepmother. Like, it's not a typical, I think, respectable family at the time, or at least she isn't a typical respectable woman for that time period. So you kind of start off already with a bit of a negative connotation, or at least a perceived negative connotation, that like, oh, there's already some stuff kind of stacked against him. And then there's the whole birthing sick. So basically she gets knocked up pretty quick, and that's basically why they get married, which apparently, after some research, actually happened quite a lot back then. I kind of had thought that due to that time period, it would be a little more conservative in terms of, like, I don't know, not knocking people up and doing like kind of shotgun weddings. But that's definitely not the case, because apparently it happened all the time. So he basically knocks her up. They gotta get married. And then, the story really starts there. You go through this period where I guess Shakespeare, the main character, is really depressed as shit. Like, just super, I guess, down. And his father's a bit abusive and, has this expectation of him. And there's this really great scene where he kind of fights back against his father. And, then he goes to London and writes these plays and all this stuff. But what I really thought was interesting was, like, the movie isn't really focused on this Shakespearean, like, his process of creating in London. It was more about her at home, which I think is interesting, because I think it would have been easy probably to make a movie that's just kind of like, easy to make a movie just called Shakespeare and make it about Shakespeare, right? Like a biopic. But they decided to, kind of focus on, I believe her real name was Anne Hathaway. In the movie, they call her Agnes. I mean, it's Agnes, but that's what they call her. Which I think her real name is Anne Hathaway in real life. I don't know why they chose that name. I think there's something about how she was listed in a will somewhere. I don't know. My friend told me about it, but I don't really remember. But they really focus on her character a lot, which I think is an interesting choice, but it ended up being really good. It was very, like, tastefully done. But this it's so dark. Like, it's just so, there were a lot of moments where I was just kind of uncomfortable with how depressing it was. I think they depicted a lot of things really, really well. There was a scene, where she was giving birth, and just that whole sequence of her giving birth to, honestly, there was a birth scene for each of the children, and they were all pretty, I've seen some bad birth scenes in my day. Like, House of Dragon birth has got to be a top 10 terrible. Like, I just never need to see that again. But these were pretty fine. Like, they didn't show much, which I'm very grateful for, because that probably it wouldn't have been fun to see. But yeah, those scenes were all done really well, and I think they really focused on her struggle. The movie, I guess, maybe I'll talk about cinematography. The movie was beautifully shot. I think there were some really, it wasn't like groundbreaking. It wasn't one of those movies where you're afterwards kind of like thinking like, oh man, how did they do that? Or, oh, that looked really cool. Or that, like, it wasn't over the top in terms of their cinema. It just was what it needed to be. It wasn't really something that, I wouldn't say experimented a whole lot. It wasn't something that, had these crazy dolly shots but it still was pleasant to watch, and it was still really well done. I think there weren't any shots that stood out to me as kind of abrupt or out of place, I guess is probably the best way to put it. Like, I feel like a lot of the times when I'm watching movies, especially maybe some of the newer films that are coming out nowadays, there are these kind of abrupt, weird shots that don't feel like they really need to be there. Like, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but Netflix had come out with some new kind of mechanical dolly system, a robotic tripod essentially, where you had all these abrupt movements and you could move it and it would follow. Basically, like, I forget what it's called. Not motion tracking. Oh, where they like take a picture of the same thing multiple times. Oh no, I don't remember what it's called, but they used it a lot. Motion tracking? I feel like it's motion tracking. Basically, you would have the camera move in a certain way every time, and it would be perfect every time. But essentially, they could do this on a grander scale by moving the camera. Everything was, probably computed by AI, and it would move exactly how it's supposed to move. And they use that in a lot of action movies at a time. I know they used it in Severance. If anyone knows that like elevator shot, they used it in Severance for that. But when Netflix came out with that, I don't even know if it was Netflix that came out. I might be like misattributing things, but it was used very abruptly in a few of those movies. I think there was a Ryan Reynolds movie, from what I recall, that really was like, okay, well, there's a difference between using it because it fits and using it because you have it and it's like cool. And I might sound a bit like jaded or negative with that, but I just feel like sometimes some filmmakers, for whatever reason, and I'm not criticizing them in a way like, I don't know what was going on, but sometimes they just use things that are just kind of like, why do we need to do that? Like the dolly shot with, oh my God, why can't I think of anybody right now? Spike Lee? Is that his name? Spike Lee, fucking Black Klansman. Yeah, Spike Lee. Like the Spike Lee dolly shot always, to me, I know that's like his signature, but I find it so abrupt for the way that he makes movies. Like there was a movie with Inside Man, that's what it's called, by Spike Lee, where the whole movie shot in this kind of static way, where everything's very, it feels meticulous in the way it's lined up, and this person's standing here and this camera's going to move here. And then in the middle of the movie, there's this weird dolly shot. I think that's probably the best example I could make of like sometimes these weird kind of interesting camera movements or ways of shooting a scene don't fit. And in this movie, in Hamnet, there's none of that. It's very kind of personal. I think a good portion of it, it seems like they did like a good portion of Steadicam, where someone was holding it and moving it, and then kind of just tripod shots, like kind of static tripod shots or very linear movements. Like there was no abrupt movement aside from some of the Steadicam scenes, which they really only used in times that felt kind of high emotion or high stakes, which I think is probably another thing that they, strategically did. But overall, the cinematography was really awesome. There were some scenes that I don't know how they did. Like some of the scenes where they're in kind of old town London. Spoiler again, I'm sorry if you haven't seen the movie, but he loses his son and he stands on the edge of this, I guess, I don't know how to call it, a bay, I guess would be the only way to put it. And he's very clearly thinking about jumping off, and they kind of show this dimly lit ocean with this large sprawling, I don't know, 18th, 19th century. That's probably before that, actually, probably like 16th, 17th century London. And I'm curious, like, how much CG they use for that, or if they kind of resorted to some more old school, like matte paintings, because it looked pretty good and it didn't look like low budget CG. I'd have to look up the budget of the movie, but I'm going to take a wild guess that they didn't have a huge CG budget. Production budget's 30 to 35 million. So that's enough for like 3 good effect shots or whatever, I guess. But it was done really well. I didn't notice it. It looked really good. I actually really like the depiction of the plague. There's a scene where he's walking through a street in London, and it's very clearly kind of I guess dealing with the plague and how dark that time was. And I think it did a really good job of showing that without being really too far, like kind of disgusting. It did show it in a way that was like, okay, clearly this is happening. And that was really good. I thought, they dealt with the plot points very well. I will say, I guess we'll move on from cinematography and kind of more to the pacing. Sorry again, I'm kind of like all over the place. This is my first time doing this. I'm sure I'll get better over time, but I guess we'll move on from cinematography to pacing. The pacing did feel a little slow at times. And I don't know why it felt slow. Like, when I really think about what happened, it's not a slow burn. Like it things do happen quite abrupt, but when I did think about it a little more, it might be just because of how abrupt that first kind of sequence is, or first act even. It all happens very quickly, where they basically very quickly set up the relationship of the two main characters and then very quickly move into then, their family dynamic and what happens to them, and Shakespeare's depression and him having a reason to go to London, things like that. So maybe that's why the second half of the film, or even maybe like the third act, felt pretty slow. I felt a bit. It doesn't feel long. It didn't feel like I was bored at any point, but I definitely did find myself noticing, like, oh, where's this gonna, like, it was very close to the line of me getting a little frustrated with the pacing. But overall, it was completely fine. I think, I think it's just because that setup at the first section of the movie was so quickly and it felt so abrupt that you kind of just, once things do slow down to a normal pace, or at least a more, I guess, average pace, it feels slow. So maybe that's why. But I did notice myself kind of thinking about it when I was watching it, like, oh, the pace kind of slowed down quite a bit. I guess the next part I want to talk about is, in general, the story. Like, the story was really well done. I think there's a I'm going to talk about, I think, my favorite scene in the movie, or at least my favorite few scenes that really, I think, worked. And something I would do in this is I kind of talk about the things that work and things that don't work. So I'll talk about the things that I feel like work, especially in terms of like my favorite scenes, what I felt like, really impacted me. The first scene where basically his daughter, I forget her name, unfortunately, but the first, his middle child, I believe, or his other section of the, what am I trying to say? He has twins. Sorry, I'm all over the place. He has twins, and it's a male and a female. Hamnet is the male. The other one, I can't remember the name, but she gets the bubonic plague. She gets the Black Plague. And Hamnet kind of can sense that his sister's going to pass away soon. That the disease is going to take her. And there's this really awesome scene where he, gets in bed with her and says, I'm going to be brave. And it basically, I can't remember the exact lines, but he essentially is like, I'm going to sacrifice myself for you. And that's a really impactful scene, I think, because earlier in the movie, we have this setup of, Shakespeare's kind of leaving the house all the time. And he's, this kid is kind of left to his own devices in terms of being the man in the house. And, he tells him, you need to be brave. And he's like, I'll be brave. So there's this huge setup of that. And then the kid, finally being brave. And essentially, it is framed like he's kind of saving his sister, which I think is really tragic, but also, kind of beautiful in a way. And then, so Hamnet ends up getting the plague and his sister ends up being fine. And from what I remember, it seems like Shakespeare, they don't really talk about how they're communicating. I'm assuming it's all by letter, but they don't really focus on it too much. So maybe that's something I don't like about the movies. They're not really clearly showing how much Shakespeare knew about how sick his children were. Because I think he knew his kid was sick while he was gone. And basically, I guess I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but basically Hamnet gets, the plague. There's this really difficult scene that, man, it was basically Hamnet gets the plague. He's clearly got a bad fever. They're kind of dealing with this. The daughter wakes up and she feels fine. And the mother comes in and looks at the daughter and she's like, oh, you're feeling better. And then the kid, Hamnet is obviously has the plague and he's not doing too well. And there's this really, his passing in the movie is really strikingly difficult to watch. Maybe I just have a soft spot for kids in pain, and it kind of affects me in a way. It makes me a bit emotional, but his passing in that movie was really difficult to watch. He, calls for his mother, says he's weak, he's not feeling well, and it's a tough scene. But it is really impactful. I think it's probably, and it leads up to probably my favorite scene in the movie. So unfortunately, Hamnet passes, and it's a very difficult scene, and then Shakespeare comes home, and he sees his daughter, and it's this really terrible situation that we kind of have to watch, where he's very ecstatic to see his daughter. He's super happy to see her, and he's happy that she's alive. And then again, it's something that, like, it's this terrible thing where you see a father who's happy that his daughter hasn't died, but then at the cost of his son dying. You know what I mean? It's like this terrible, just this terrible position to be in. And I think that's one of my favorite scenes in the movie. So he comes in the house and he's ecstatic to see his daughter, and then he asks, where is he? And he kind of asks it a few times, and then he just kind of breaks, and yeah, it's a really impactful scene, and I think it's probably my favorite scene in the movie. If not the ending scene, it's probably that one. I think it's just such a difficult scene to deal with, but it's a really great scene. And it's just such a tough dilemma that he's kind of faced with, where Paul Mescal, I mean, I gotta be honest, like, it's such a good performance from him, because he really portrays the joy that he has to see his daughter, and then the absolute just crushing loss that he has to experience, right after. So it's such a great kind of display of really good acting and really good filmmaking, and it was just such a treat to be able to watch it. I know that sounds terrible for what the circumstance in the movie is, but it was such an awesome scene and display of really, like, actors and directors working well together. Excuse me. And then we move on to kind of the final bit of the movie, where the mother is pretty much, depressed, as you would expect. She's pretty depressed. And Shakespeare's trying to kind of, I guess, deal with it in his own way, and they kind of end up clashing a little bit, and she blames him for not being there. And then we get to the final act of the movie, where she finds out that he's putting on a play called Hamlet. He's written a play called Hamlet. She learns from her stepmother. She gets upset, and she goes to London to, I guess, confront him, because I'm not sure. I had to look this up as well, because Hamnet and Hamlet are different names, right? Like, different spelling and everything, but apparently they were just the same name. Like, I don't know. It was very odd when I looked it up that, like, it could be spelled those ways and that essentially meant the same name. I don't know. I found very weird, like, it's just very weird explanations for it. But essentially she realizes that it's her, it's using her dead son's name, and she gets upset, and she goes and she watches the play. And another scene, actually, before I get into that, I'm sorry, I keep kind of jumping around, but there's a scene where they go to where he's living in London, and he's kind of living in not squalor, but it's not the nicest place. It's basically like a shitty studio apartment. And, you know, I think they say like, oh, the greatest playwright is living in this place. Like, why would he do this to himself? And I think it was kind of interesting, at least when I saw it, it kind of felt like this weird moment of kind of, it's not like he's doing this because it's making him rich or because he's living such a better life away from his family. It's something that he has to do. And we kind of get exposed to that a little bit earlier in the movie, where he's up late at night and he's drank a little too much and he's writing and he's just kind of having a breakdown. And he just keeps saying like, let me work. I need to work. Please let me work. And I think it's just an interesting culmination of kind of, it's not like he's going to this place to live a lavish kind of extravagant life that he can't get at home. And I think it was just interesting. I don't know. I think it was something that I had in mind when I kept watching the movie. So I think it's important to note. But then we finally progress. She goes to the opening of the play, and we basically, I'm sure we don't see the full version because I think Hamlet's a couple hours long in play form, but she starts freaking out. And then, you know, she starts yelling in the crowd, like, stop saying my son's name, all these things. And then we finally see the character of Hamlet come out. And it's this kind of, you know, rambunctious, confident actor. And I think it's Tom Holland's brother, I believe. I think. I might be wrong, but I don't know. Great actor, whoever played Hamlet. I think it's Tom Holland's brother. I should probably look that up. But and then you see this switch in her facial expressions and her kind of body language, where she starts to get invested in the play. And I don't really know much about the play itself prior to, you know, watching the movie, like I mentioned at the beginning, but it to me felt like he was depicting his son as exactly what he was like doing the best by his kid, if that makes sense, was the feeling that I got. And it seems like she realizes that. And, you know, and then Shakespeare himself plays the father who is dead. And there's this really difficult kind of realization that he would trade places if he could, almost, you know. At least that's what I took away from it. I could be very wrong. I might have like a Shakespeare expert listening. They're like, you're a fucking idiot. But that's the vibe I got. And it was really difficult. It was really impactful to see the change of, you know, her mentality about the play. And then she kind of realizes like, okay, this is fine. You know, I don't know. It was this weird moment where they both played this kind of, you know, they're both kind of gripping with the reality of the situation through this play. And they're both being able to do it at the same time. You know, one by him creating this to be able to kind of get it off his chest and show this in an expression. And then her being able to watch this and also deal with it. So I think that was it was done really well. And again, the actress who plays Agnes, or Anne Hathaway, is really great. Jessie Buckley, that's her name. She was really great in the movie. Again, I'd never seen her before, but it was a really good performance. And at the end of the play, this was also a really difficult part of the movie. This whole movie's like really difficult. Earlier in the movie, when Hamnet passes, we get this almost vision of this woodland backdrop, and he's calling to a bird that passes earlier in the film, his mother's bird that passes, a hawk. And she says earlier in the film that, you know, you can call him whenever and he's around, essentially. And he calls him and he shows up. So you then get the confirmation that he is dead, but then also that, you know, yeah, that he's dead. And then we get this kind of backdrop that we don't know what it is yet. And there's this kind of opening. If you've seen the movie, you know, but there's this opening in the middle, and he essentially he looks out towards the woods, and then you can kind of tell that he starts walking into the darkness, which I'm assuming is kind of a euphemism for the afterlife. And then there's this really good scene that towards the end of the play, the end of the movie, she's looking at the actor playing her son, essentially, who is also dying in the play. And then, you know, she looks at the actor and she looks up, and it's the same backdrop that we saw when Hamnet passes away. And we see the arch, and then, you know, she looks, and we kind of see a blank stare, and then it kind of cuts back to the backdrop, and her son is there. And so it's kind of like this weird moment where you get this, again, it's kind of like her, I think, processing his death in a way, but a really, really, really great ending. And it was more impactful than I thought it would be. I think going into it, I really didn't have super high or super low expectation. I was very middle ground. Like, I expected a good performance out of Paul Mescal, and I definitely got that. But she surprised me quite a bit, and the movie as a whole surprised me quite a bit. So yeah, definitely like a 10 out of 10. I really don't have any issues with the movie, but I will talk about some things that I didn't like, just to kind of wrap up. Something that I didn't particularly like in the movie was, I guess, I would have liked to see a bit more on Shakespeare. Like I mentioned it earlier, that we don't really have an idea of what like logically what's happening there. Like, we don't know how he's communicating. We don't know if he know what he knows is going on, or if he knows what's going on. We kind of have this weird, again, I know we're focusing on the wife as a character, but there are some like logical issues there that I have just personally as and this is me really nitpicking and being a dick. Like, we don't know what he knows, but again, it's also like kind of part of the movie that we don't really know what he's up to. So I don't know. That's something that you could say if I was really being nitpicky. But another point that my friend actually mentioned to me while after we had watched it and we were all kind of talking about it was that the whole plot point that the son, Hamnet, kind of comes in the bed and essentially takes the plague from her. It's a bit kind of, you know, it's a movie for sure. You know, like, I don't know how that would work in reality. Maybe there's something I don't know about the plague, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't work that way. And that was kind of a thing for him that I think it knocked his rating down by like a point or something because of that. But overall, you know, those are really the only things that I didn't like. I will say, I don't like the pacing of that first section. I mentioned it earlier that it just kind of starts really abrupt. It starts kind of out of nowhere and fast, and bam, they're married, she's pregnant, blah, blah, blah. Like, and then the rest of the movie is at a normal pace. I do kind of wish we either just skipped the introduction of their relationship and started post them being married, or we at least spent a little bit more time, maybe add like 5-6 minutes to the runtime and just expand on that opening act and section a little more. I think it would have made me maybe be more invested in what they were going through as a couple. Cause like, I gotta be honest, when they had like fought in the movie, or when they were having, I don't know, troubles, I guess, because they lost their son, or like when they were saying mean things to each other or whatever it was going to be, I didn't feel a huge emotional attachment to that. And I think a part of that is because of that first section that moves pretty quickly. And I always kind of talk about this when I talk about movies, like, you have to spend enough time on the characters or on an aspect of the characters that makes me care about it, right? And to be honest, I didn't particularly care about their, you know, relationship, which again, maybe isn't the point of the movie. And it's more about, you know, just her dealing with it and him dealing with it, the passing of their kid. But again, we don't really get much of a, like, I didn't particularly care for those moments where she was being quite rude to him and saying pretty mean things, and, you know, their relationship was kind of falling apart. I don't think we had enough time with them or at least in their kind of couple phase, for me to care about that as much as I think they maybe wanted me to care about it. But again, that's me being super nitpicky. It's just like, I maybe would have liked to see an extra 5 to 10 minutes on just their relationship and kind of the start of it and what happened, and because it just moves so fast that I don't care. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, maybe that's like too nitpicky and kind of mean, but that would be my only like real critique of the movie, would be that I don't feel like it spent enough time on them as a couple, as just him and her, for me to care about the issues that they went through later. Aside from the things, I did care that they lost a kid, in terms of I cared from a movie sense, from a story sense, I cared about what she was going through as a mother, and I cared about what he was going through as a father, but I didn't particularly care what they were going through as a couple. So that would probably be my main critique. But other than that, honestly, it was definitely one of the best movies I've seen this year. It was a 2026 watch. I know it came out last year, but it was definitely a solid watch. Give it a watch. Sorry if I spoiled some things and you hadn't watched it, but what did you think? Let me know. Don't forget to rate, and I don't know. I don't know what you do on podcasts, but do the 5 stars, the normal thing. But anyway, that's it. Next week, I don't particularly know what I'm gonna be getting into, but I'll be getting into something. I did decide for TV shows, I'm not gonna make episodic stuff. Like, I'm not gonna do like, next week we're talking about Fallout episode 3. Like, I'm just gonna talk about the show when it's done and kind of give an overview of the season, because I feel like doing the episodic things I could, but then I might be missing a chance to do a different movie or a different show. Like, if I'm doing Fallout, the final episode 1 week, or let's say Fallout episode 1 week, Fallout episode 2 the second week, like, then I'm kind of missing out on other things that I could be doing in terms of movies or TV shows that I'm watching. So I did decide, like, I'm not going to talk about a TV show until the season's over, and I can talk about the whole season. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for this one. Thank you for listening, if you're listening this far, and I'll catch you on the next one.